Okay, I think I'm ready to put it into plaster now. I know where all the cuts are going to go, and all the edges are filleted, cleaned up so that the edges, we know where to locate the edges. So this just gives me a road map. I'm going to direct carve it. I'm going to make the shims for the mold, the waste mold, and I'm going to remove, these are litho plates from offset printing, work quite well. You can use roof flashing that you get at the hardware store. You just need a thin aluminum type metal. Brass is a little expensive. It doesn't really what you make these shims out of. There's a little edge there I'm going to take off. This can be cut with scissors. I use a glove because this is as sharp as razor blades. Now I might be able to use that later on, so I'm not going to throw that away. I like to make my shims nice and wide into the clay, at least 4 inches wide. You can always do it a little wider. I'm doing it for economy at 4 inches. That'll give me a 2-inch, at least a good 2-inch shim. And the important thing to remember in mold making, any type of mold making, is your registration. Your registration is what, when the two halves come back together, how accurately do the halves match up. We want those halves to match up perfectly so that your plaster does not become misaligned. Now I'll make several strips like this. Okay, in making the shims, we can use big large straight shapes, but as we start getting curves, you want narrower shims. We're going to try and find the parting line. You don't want to have it come down through the ear. You want to either have it on the back side of the ear or the front side of the ear. I think since the head is tilting this way, I'm going to put the shim line on the back side of the ear and this side on the front side of the ear. I don't have to worry about being cut so much here, so I don't need my glove. But make a couple long straight shims. And you can bend it like this. Nice little V slot is nice. Now that's a nice key. Do the same over here. Okay, got a couple keys. I'll make one more. Finding the parting line is crucial. Like I said before, this is where I want the half to separate. So I'm finding the parting line. You want to be able to see that they'll all separate. Now I'm going to come to this side and find the parting line here. I want it to go on this side of the ear. You want to just make sure that both halves will be able to separate. That's what's important. No undercuts. Now, we've got a parting line there and a slight angle there. Now we've got our parting line. We want these to be tight. If they're not tight, it will present some difficulties. So it's not going to be preserved, it's going to be broken apart. I'm running into the armature a little bit. That's a good reason why to bury the armature a little deeper. That's no problem. Just like folding a deck of cards. Now you still got to make sure that it's pulled straight out. You don't want the plaster to be interlocked. Interlocking plaster is not good. Okay, I'm going to push the half. It's best to have the halves perpendicular to each other, perpendicular to the sculpture. At least that is the most desirable. So a little bit of there we go. Throw in a little clay right here. Perfect. I can just fill in that line. And I've got 1, 2, 3 keys. That'll be good. Okay. Nice and wide so you get nice registration. Registration is king. You want to put it in back so that the plaster will drip off that edge and not into, like roofing tiles. Again, I forgot to turn my microphone on, so I'll narrate. On the back side of this, I'm going to cover it with a little bit of plastic to prevent plaster from overflowing the shims and landing on the back side of this. So you want to protect it. In the old days, I used to just wet newspaper and put wet newspapers on the back. We now have plastics that work just fine. So I'm using a plastic garbage bag. That'll preserve it during the plaster process. Now I add Mrs. Stewart's liquid bluing. The reason why I use it is because it will not leave a tint in your plaster. Most pigments will leave a slight coloration in your final plaster, and it doesn't stain. So I mix a good portion of that in my water. I'm doing 2-to-1 coats, 2-to-1, 2 plasters to 1 water. So I'm using 2 quarts of water and 4 quarts of plaster. You'll see that I'm shaking it in with my fingertips, allowing each subsequent handful to become fully submerged before the next handful goes in. Slowly mixing in the plaster till I get a peak coming out of the top of the bowl. When it finally just rests is when you have enough. There, it's now peaked. And I'll just put a little bit around the sides, and I'll let that sit for 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, until it becomes fully absorbed. The thicker you mix your plaster, the stronger it will be. We want it fairly medium, not real hard, so that's a medium hardness plaster. I've allowed the plaster to slake now for about 5 minutes, and I'm just putting on a little stirring it before I flick it on. I thought I had my microphone on, so you'll see me trying to narrate it. I'm not chewing food. The primary areas I want to be concerned with are the eyes, up under the nose, up under the chin, in the ears, and up under the shoulders. Any place where there's an undercut, you want to make sure you get plenty of plaster in there. Want to be sure to get all the registration and the face with this one first coat. flick it with your fingers and your wrist and not your elbow. Kind of give it a forceful flick, that way it will go into the cavities like the eye, up under the nose, up under the chin, in the ears, behind the ears. Again, up underneath those areas. The plaster is fairly loose at this time. I want to get a good coverage before I start recycling the plaster. Sometimes you get little bits of clay in there, and it's okay to use the recycled plaster on the flanges. Now I'm going to use a Bondo scraper and scrape the plaster into my bowl. This recycles it. Now I'll probably work on the flanges. The plaster's starting to get a little thicker with each coat, with each iteration of applying the plaster. Now I'm getting it well out to the ends of the flanges or of the shims. And covering the entire shim. I'm going to take an air hose and try to knock some of the bubbles out, lightly hosing it. Don't use a lot of pressure, just light pressure, up under the nose, in the ears. If there's any bubbles formed, this will get those bubbles out. And if there is a bubble, usually you'll see a piece of clay underneath, or the color of the clay. So that'll let you know that you had a bubble. Again, recycling the plaster. I want to get this plaster a good 1/4 inch thick of blue coat, so that I have a little bit of protection there. Again, working the edge of against the, building up the edge between the model and the shim. Checking the up underneath. Be very diligent about checking up underneath. Now I'm using a chip brush to kind of cover the areas that might have been missed. Each time I do a pass of the plaster will get thicker. You want to get a kind of a rough surface texture to this so that the next coat will adhere to it. It's the interlocking plaster that will keep the plaster from separating from each other. Again, the plaster is getting more like sour cream. I'm adding a little bit of texture there with the air hose so that the plaster will interlock. The second coat will kind of interlock with it. And then building the shape of the bottom flange. You don't need a lot of material there at the bottom. That's just more stuff to break off.